Afternoon, everyone. I'm Adasha Townsend. I'm the content director for Supply Side Food and Beverage Journal, the media brand. We're living in a golden age of food innovation, a time when science and creativity converge to create culinary experiences that tantalize the senses. But it's not just about the taste, it's about the entire sensory experience. In the next 45 minutes, we're going to dive deep into the world of sensory science and explore how it can revolutionize the way we develop food and beverage products. We'll discuss the latest techniques for creating low sugar, high fiber delights and how to manipulate texture to create mouth-watering experiences. We'll also delve into the power of multisensory marketing, harnessing sight, sound, and smell to create unforgettable food moments. And we'll also explore the role of artificial intelligence and big data in predicting consumer preferences and developing products that people crave. So, joining me on stage is first Dr. Laura Ramden, the Chief Innovation and Science Officer for Upcycle Foods Incorporated. Ramden's vision and dedication to sustainable food systems and nutrition have established her as a thought leader in creating solutions that nourish both people and the planet. Next to her is Dalton Honore. I pronounced that correct? Thank you. Is the founder of Dreamland Kofucha, a company specialized in lightly fermented cold brew coffee. I'm yet to taste it. Food scientist with nearly a decade of experience in the food and beverage industry, his most recent experience has him serving as the head of quality and new product development for a beverage co-manufacturer. And Elizabeth Glenn is a senior sensory scientist at Land O'Lakes with more than 18 years of experience in sensory and consumer research, food innovation, and new product development. Glenn has broad knowledge of sensory science as a discipline, as well as extensive experience turning knowledge into products that turning knowledge into products that delight. Let's give them a warm welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so let's first define sensory science and how it's relevant for food and beverage development. Let's go first, Liz.
So, sensory science, for those of you guys who might not be familiar, is really the application of the senses and the use of experimental design principles to gather data to help drive insights into product development. So, we're using humans as instruments to really understand their experiences, their preferences, and then translate that into specific design parameters, and that can be for food product design and really anything that you can think of from a CPG perspective.
Laura?
I think the sensory science is the hidden jewel, if you like, when it comes to product development, because it's almost the things that you don't notice and take for granted that help you to enjoy and delight in a product, whether that be the packaging, the taste, the smell, and the feeling of fullness and comfort. All of that is down to sensory science and sensory biology.
Dot, you want to give this a good run?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that when I think about it, I think about sensory science as the experience. So if you think about Coca-Cola, they say taste the feeling. That's exactly what sensory is, right? So beyond just taste, it's how does it make you feel? How does it, and that goes down to the sight, the smell, etc. So really, it's a broad range of the experience that the product gives you.
How much of your natural instincts play into your practice of sensory science? And is it okay to have preconceived notions about the product development before you apply into sensory science to it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that just sort of like Liz mentioned, it really is more about the human element. So a lot of food science has to do with the analytical, but when you start to talk about sensory science, you talk about the objective or the subjective, excuse me. And so I think that it's impossible to kind of remove your preconceived ideas from the process of developing whatever product you're developing. But also you do want to kind of take a step back and think about it from a more objective standpoint as much as you can, but recognizing that you are going to have some biases when you go into any type of development.
I think you can't talk about sensory science without talking about neurobiology. And that's because biologically, physically, the senses are linked to memories, and memories come from culture, and come from upbringing, and come from where you live. And so when we talk about the sense of smell, and there's lots of people here who are experts in the sense of smell, whether that be Givaudan, IFF, or whatever. In particular, that's linked to memory and what you've experienced as you've been growing up. And taste is obviously linked to smell. So as a human being, it's almost impossible to disassociate from bias. But that's why in sensory testing, when you're doing sensory testing, and I'm sure Liz will talk a bit about this, we try very hard to use screening methodologies whereby people are essentially trained to be expert panels. So the bias is almost trained away so that when you're assessing a food or a beverage, you're assessing it purely on those sensory characteristics without that additional bias.
Okay, Liz.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there's a couple of different ways that we can think about this. So there's the subjective piece that Dalton was just talking about, where we're really trying to capture people's innate responses to whatever it is we're trying to analyze. And in that way, we're trying to come at it from the perspective of being very open-minded and hearing truly what people are responding to and how they're approaching the experience of the product itself and all that sort of thing. And we're using behind the scenes the balanced presentation methodologies, the focus groups that have been carefully selected to screen for the people that we really want to hear for, like our target market and things like that, so that we're not being blindsided by our selection bias from a sampling perspective. So we're controlling all of those things behind the scenes so that we can really listen deeply and unbiasedly when we're talking with consumers themselves. And then when we're in the laboratory setting, then we're doing a lot of things like blind presentation of products and blind codes, and using really good design principles for setting up our studies, making sure that we're controlling for the presentation effect of the products themselves, airflow, lighting, all those types of things. I always jokingly say that sensory scientists are like the friendliest control freaks you'll ever meet, because we really care about humans, but we also really want to understand where the actual sources of variance are coming from when we're looking at products. And so it's kind of a both and, depending on what we're trying to do, whether we're trying to control for different factors so that we can really pay attention to the signal versus noise from a treatment, or whether really trying to do kind of fuzzy front end work where we want really unbiased exploration of what the consumers are really caring about. So it's a both.
So I had the privilege a few weeks ago going to Cargill and getting a tour of their innovation center, and then they let me be a sensory scientist for the day, in a sense. So they put me in this little room, they put me in this little booth, and I had to taste 3 different chocolate frostings, and all they did was number them, and I had to rate them from 1 to 5. From 1 to 5, saying, how does it smell before you even taste it? How does it look to you? Rated from 1 to 5, and then describe. Be very descriptive and vividly descriptive. How does it look? And then the next one was, how does it smell? Describe the smell from 1 to 5 for each one, and then for each one of these. And so I like to say, I felt like Goldilocks. Let's just say that. Basically, I felt like Goldilocks. I liked the third one better. It tasted just right. It smelled just right. I liked the look of it. I didn't like the other 2. And they did not have, I was not in like a controlled setting. So it was, it wasn't the usual one, because of course it takes 6 months to be trained to be one of their scientists. But just to throw me in there, just to get a feeling of it, I love that feeling. So I'd like to know some ways that people who don't have the luxury of having a lab, or those type of the lab, or something that you have, or you have, that they could just do on their own, something like what I did. What can they do?
Okay, so I'll start, and then you guys feel free to build. So if you are just working at this from like a very pragmatic perspective, like especially if we're working in like a field location, like at a production facility or something like that, the first thing you're going to want to keep in mind is you're going to try to control as much as you can, so that you don't want extraneous odors from like a production floor or cleaning fluids, things like that. like kind of biasing you or coloring your senses, so to speak. So that's one thing that you for sure want to be aware of. The other one is just using those good experimental design principles. So you still want to be able to blind code your samples so that you don't have a presentation effect. So the first sample is oftentimes the one that people like the best, which is why we blind code samples, so people don't know what the differences are between the samples in advance. So you don't say 1, 2, 3 or variable XYZ as far as like age or something like that. And then you do want to try to have unbiased tasters. So you don't want to tell people, hey, we're running a shelf life evaluation, or hey, we're looking at the cost reduction, or what have you. You just want to say, hey, I need you to come take a look at some samples, give us your input on this, and then be very clear about what the goal of the evaluation is, whether you're talking about whether or not it's a preference test or something like that, or whether you just need descriptive information from your panelists or your respondents. You just want to be very clear about what it is you're trying to learn from them, and very clear about what the instructions are to your panelists. And in your case, you were talking about whether or not you like something, and you were mixing that in with the ratings of intensities, which is actually something we like to separate out. We don't ask both in the same time, because your hedonic senses are very different from your evaluative senses, your analytical sense. And so as human beings, we typically like to say whether or not we like something or we dislike something, but it's a little bit harder for us to actually quantify our experiences. And that's where what Adasha was talking about, where it does take quite a bit of time to get people to the point where they can be calibrated and really provide reliable data. And so in the case of having an informal sensory panel, you just have to be very clear. So you might be able to provide references and say, okay, so what we're looking at, and let's just pretend we're looking at peanut butters or something like that. You might give them some references for roasted and give them evaluation and say, hey, this is unroasted, this is lightly roasted, and this is heavily roasted, or something like that. So you'd give them references so you can give them some idea of where to scale things. So that might be something if you're actually trying to figure out like how to evaluate something in more of an analytical fashion. Or if you're just like, hey guys, what do you think? We're working on some innovation stuff, and here's some flavors for next spring or something like that. That might be a very different conversation. So you want to make sure you're setting up the parameters to make sure that you're being able to answer the questions that you're really trying to answer in the evaluation.
Yeah, and I agree with everything she said. So I sort of look at it in 3 tiers. So the first tier is really going to be that preferential sort of tier. So do you like it? Do you dislike it? And so I, personally, what I did with my company, I have a food and beverage sort of community in the city that I come from. And so we just sent out samples to everybody that, we sent an email out and say, hey, we're trying to develop this product. Are y'all willing to, give us some feedback? Sent the product out and got just like, dislike. And then from there, we sort of went into, okay, give us some of the more descriptive sort of metrics. So what do you like? What don't you like? Why don't you like it? What flavor profiles are you picking up on? What scents are you picking up on? And so, when you kind of start at the bottom, when you're just kind of go preferential and you're developing a product, it's really, is this something that tastes good? Is it something that smells good, et cetera? But then when you start to go more into the descriptive, you're really looking to say, okay, this is what, the product is supposed to taste like, what the experience is supposed to be every single time that I make the product. And so once you get to a place to where you sort of have these sort of descriptive notes, then I start to move into, and this is typically further down the line, I'll start to move more into like, okay, let's sort of optimize the formulation. So we know that these are the descriptors that we're looking for. We know these are the flavor notes. These are the scents that we're looking for. And so now let's start to look at, okay, how can we optimize costs by saying, if we switch this ingredient out, are we still hitting those flavor notes that 1 were liked and were preferred, but then 2 were, what was expected from that panel. And so you kind of go from a very broad sense. And again, like I have that technical background, but I'm also someone that is a brand builder. And so for me, it was super important to be super scrappy. And there were some of those more, detailed evaluations that I could do, but I kind of threw those out the window because at the end of the day, we're all humans. We're eating food. We're drinking products. And so do you like the product? Don't you like it? What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? And then how can I optimize what's still fitting within those parameters that that we set?
I used to work for big corporations and also a startup, and now work for a not-for-profit, FoodX Climate. And I would say don't underestimate the power of a good qualitative research. I think that we tend to lean towards the quantitative and think that we have to do those quantitative tests, and I think they have their place. But I have found real insight from a good qualitative. And what I mean by that is that it's a smaller sample size. And so it might be 8 to 10 people. And it's with and we used to call them, when I was working in beauty, we used to call them girlfriends workshops, but, and you used to invite your girls around and talk about skincare. But, you know, the qualitative done right with a smaller group of people with a clear objective can give you depth of insight, right? And depth on sensory, depth of language that you might want to use in order to build your brand and describe your product, depth of storytelling as well. That's where, you know, that's where I pulled out some of the most meaningful things that I've ever worked on when it comes to beverages or supplements or snacks. Actually, is the real richness in qualitative. And especially if you're a scrappy startup, it's much easier to get, you know, 8 or 10 people, friends of friends, and share with them a product in that concept and say it's something, a work in progress, and almost crowdsource that data in that kind of setting than trying to control for all the parameters and do a sort of mini QDA when you don't have the tools.
So let's take one of those aspects that you just talked about. You said snacks, you said beverages. If you could only have one, if you could only, you're at a time crunch, you can only pick one aspect of sensory science. Time crunch, money crunch, which one would you pick? How could you do that?
Well, I mean, sensory science is sensory is all linked to one another because you taste with your eyes, right? I know people don't think about the visual. Perhaps we talk about taste being king all the time, right? Taste is king, but actually the tasting starts with your eyes, and that actually activates your brain, your memory, to imagine what that food tastes like. So you wouldn't be able to separate one thing, but if I had to do one test, one test, it would be qualitative. I would literally get 5 people in my living room, and I've had no money. 5 people in my living room, actually measure out the snack, so at least that's controlled, and get them to talk about it for an hour. That's what I would do.
Dalton?
Exactly the same. I mean, I think that she hit it right on the money. Yeah, it really, you know, you can try to go in the weeds as much as you want, but at the end of the day, there's nothing more, I guess, valuable than actually getting out the product out in the market and saying, hey, do you like it? Don't you like it? And let's sit around and talk about it.
I do think there's also an opportunity to include the competition, by the way, in that setting, right? Let's not forget benchmarks. And I'm sure we talk about benchmarking all the time. If you work at big companies, you're constantly benchmarking. Just because you're a small company doesn't mean to say you can't, in that qualitative setting, include benchmarks.
Yeah, that's actually what I was just going to add. So I wouldn't pick a particular methodology, but it's always about the question you're trying to answer or what it is that you're trying to understand. And so if you're at the very early stages of working on a new product or something like that, or you're a startup or something, trying to understand who it is that is your lead users, or the people who you think are the people that you're trying to tap into with your product, and doing like what Laura said, having some conversations with them. If you're meeting them at a farmer's market, or if you're meeting them, you know, at Whole Foods or something like that, figuring out where exactly you might find some folks that you could actually get to react to your product. And then understanding that, and then, you know, oftentimes when the quantitative stuff is really useful, it's when you've already got a big product line that's been on the market for a really long time and you're doing very like minute differences that you're trying to detect. But when you're at the early stages, you can really have a lot of insights generated by just having some conversations with the people who are going to be the ones that are going to be using your products. So I think from a sensory perspective, like you can get into the weeds with the methodology and the details and the hardcore, like neuroscience and AI and the use of context and virtual reality and all sorts of things that we can do with fancy tools. But I think that there's nothing that will really ever get away from the fact that human beings are human beings, and we are the most sensitive instruments that are available to us. And that's actually why I love sensory science so much, is because it's always going to be linked intrinsically to humans and our experiences and how we make sense of what those are, right?
So the one thing I'll add though is you never want to lead the conversation. You never want to, you know, or guide anybody in a particular direction. So you want to make sure that whatever bias you may have or whatever thoughts you may have about the product, you kind of leave that in your own brain and let them develop their own opinions about the product.
At what point of the process during development is best to apply the science? Beginning, middle of end, or
Always,
why?
always,
Always which one?
always, from the beginning, middle, and an end. I mean,
All throughout the
all
process?
throughout. I mean,
Okay.
if the truly successful product development is constantly iterating. So, and the essence of design thinking, by the way, is to constantly iterate. So there's no oh, I've done this, now I will get to here. It's I've done this, this gives me this piece of information. Okay, I need that to use to guide that, and so on. So it's a constant iteration with a different patchwork of different methodologies to answer different questions as you move along throughout the process.
So I think that, if you think about formulation in a very broad sense, then yes, the science has to be there very early on. Even just thinking about things in terms of like shelf life, stability, and whatnot. But when we speak specifically about sensory, I don't 100% agree that the science has to be there right up front. Like we've sort of been echoing this whole time, it really is about the human experience, and a lot of times that is not something that you can, quantify that easily. That being said, as you start to build the product out and as you start to get a little more control, then yeah, you want to get the science in there because you want to start to evaluate some of the more minute and I guess harder to pin down principles that you can't really pin down at those more base levels.
Except experience is biology.
Well, that's what I was just going to say too. We're going to get really heated in here, I think.
Get into it.
Yeah.
So you can't have biology, you can't have experience without science, Dalton.
Right.
I understand that wholeheartedly, but I'll also say that
I'm talking to a scientist, so be careful.
You're also speaking
He's
to a
in between
scientist, so be
two
careful.
scientists.
All scientists.
But
Different scientists.
But what I will say is that I think a lot of times being scientists, all of us being scientists, I think that a lot of times it's very easy to to get a little too technical. And
I understand what you mean.
And so
Yeah.
when you're developing a product and you're someone who is just in your kitchen, you have a good product and you're excited about that product, the science doesn't matter. It doesn't
No,
taste.
it does. There's still science when you're
that's
mixing
the-
it. You're
Are you-
still doing
so
science in the kitchen,
You
Dalton.
you're doing science, but if you're making a pancake, I guarantee you're not thinking about the carbohydrate matrix. I guarantee you're not.
No, but you are thinking about the recipe.
No, I'm
and
not.
you are thinking about following
I don't
the
know-
recipe.
I don't know how you
You're
cook,
thinking
but not
about the
me.
recipe. You're thinking about the amount of heat you need to apply, for how long, how brown is it, when you turn it over,
So-
when it's done.
All the science is there. I think we can agree on that point. But we're not thinking about the science, and I think that's something that people that aren't scientists can agree on.
I think. Well, okay, you go
Okay,
ahead, Liz.
I'm gonna
because
break
we're
in.
not
Yeah,
gonna
I'm gonna break in.
We're not going to win
Um,
this argument.
I'm
We-
going to have to separate these two.
One of us is going
Um,
to win.
Adasha, you might
it
have to
will
help
be
out here.
me.
So what I was going to say is that I truly believe that sensory is actually a nexus of different scientific methodologies and approaches. And so when I think about it, it's ethnography, it's sociology. You're talking about food chemistry. You're talking about engineering. Exactly. Anthropology, absolutely. So it's a lot of different scientific disciplines that then you're applying and understanding how to weave those together to create the insights that then you can really turn into.
You see, Dalton, it's
great products.
ologies, therefore it's science, right?
Lots of ologies.
Lots of ologies.
My
Methodologies.
point, and then I'll let us move on.
Sorry, Odasha, you did say that we should talk to each other, like we should just debate, right? You did lead-
You
you
guys
did
are
lead
the
us in-
experts, so.
Yeah.
My point in all of it is that there's science in literally everything, and so
That's right. There we agree.
yes, we.
So now we can stop.
We do agree. We do agree. There is science in everything, but when you're developing, you are not thinking about the science, and that's my point. And it's okay to not think about the science. It's okay to not have that background. It's okay to not have 20 years of experience doing X,
Oh,
Y, Z.
that's absolutely true.
Right.
I
30.
agree with that.
I think
30,
she said
shit.
35.
I agree.
Pardon.
It's 20.
20,
not-
I'm
How
sorry.
old do you think I am? Yeah, no.
Agree to disagree. Let's move on.
No, you're right. I don't believe
Let's
that you
talk-
have to be as. Sorry,
No,
Odasha, you carry.
finish your-
I think
finish your
it's 100% fair to say that you don't need to be somebody with 20 years of experience to be able to go into your kitchen and make a product that tastes good and that you can experience well and enjoy. I agree with that 100%. But I don't agree that there isn't science behind that thought process, whether that be conscious or subconscious.
Let- Thanks. So let's talk about technology and how much technology plays. We've already talked about the human touch when it comes to this, but now AI is taking over and all sorts of technology. So how much does that play in now, and how much does that really help the process move along, as well as speed up the process? Because I know it takes a lot longer. Um, it can take a lot longer to develop a product, but with technology, you can speed it up. So talk about how that helps.
Okay, I can start us off. So there's a whole lot of different places that we could go with this. Um, so first of all, there's a lot of difference in the amount of access that different people will have to being able to leverage different types of technologies. If you're a startup or somebody who's just trying to start to create a business, your resources are obviously going to be a lot more limited. You're trying to figure out how to get funding and all sorts of things. So you might have to be leveraging things differently, or maybe working with people who are offering funding, or excuse me, offering technology as a solution, and partner with them, and maybe you wouldn't be able to purchase it yourself. But so, for example, like data analytics, so like some of the major manufacturers, grocers, et cetera, have huge operations that are there mining data and understanding how consumers are showing up in the marketplace. They're purchasing geolocations and all sorts of things, so they can understand how to target you in different areas. You're probably not going to have access to that right away. But you don't have to, and that kind of gets back to our little conversation that we were just having about when you need to have the science and when you need to have the big data. At the very early stages, you really just need to understand what's your reason for being, what job are you doing, what's the solution that you're providing in the marketplace. Once you get there and you can become more sophisticated, then, and really it comes back to just understanding your consumers' sort of pain points or I wish lists and figuring out really what's your reason for being. Then you can start to kind of personalize it and get into the big data and maybe leverage some partners. And I'll stop for now and let you guys go.
So I'll keep it brief because I think she has some. So I'll say that I'll speak about the early phases because that's sort of where my sweet spot is. I think that there's a lot of data that can be extrapolated from flavor producers if you're working with them. I think there's a lot of data that can be extrapolated from grocery stores in those early days about what consumer trends are, what types of products not only are their consumers buying, but what are they buying it in conjunction with. And so that a lot of times will inform you about who that consumer is and what type of life and experiences they're looking to have. As far as the more minute data, I am not at that place to where I'm working with that type of technology, so I don't want to speak to it, but I believe Laura probably has a little bit of experience there.
Yeah, I think I agree with Liz that the new technology in sensory is probably not accessible to anybody like a Dalton or someone who is just starting out. And let's be honest, nothing replaces the human mouth and the human nose. At the end of the day, even with the technology that's available, you still have to test with humans. All the different companies that work with, so Aramix is a company that has an AI tool, which essentially is a digital nose and a digital mouth.
How does that work?
So first of all, it's built on an algorithm that's built on empirical data, which has come from years and years and years of human testing, right? So it doesn't exist without people like Dalton and others testing and testing and testing products and feeding in that data to the algorithm. But theoretically, if you're a big company and you want to develop a food product or a beverage, you could input into the Aramix database, and based on a particular recipe, it could tell you how it's going to taste based on that algorithm. So that's a great tool for screening, right? So that does cut your development times. But at the end of the day, no Land O'Lakes, no Dreamland Kafucha, no General Mills is going to then go, okay, yeah, let's put the product on the shelf, right? They're still going to give it to consumers and make them test it. So no digital technology really overcomes that experience, to use Dalton's word. But does it help facilitate development times, and does it make them shorter? Are you able to screen multiple prototypes, right? Say, if you're not the startup where you're testing multiple prototypes in the kitchen, does it help you get through tens of prototypes quickly? Yes. So Aramix is a digital nose and a digital mouth. There is also, when I worked in beverages, I worked with the University of Nottingham, who are doing context testing using virtual reality. So it was alcoholic beverages, so it's beer, right? So you go to the Sensory Science Centre in Nottingham and you put on the virtual reality headset and you're essentially in a pub, right? and you then rate and you drink the beer while you're in the pub, but you're looking at a pub setting with a virtual reality
So
headset.
it sets the setting for
Yes, so
the whole
so
experience.
Liz alluded to context testing, right? So then you are testing the beverage in one setting. Let's just say it's in, I don't know, it's in a normal cafeteria, and then in the virtual reality setting, you're drinking the beer and you're in a pub setting. And the beer, then the beer rating, the beer tasting, is a different score based on that context testing. That for me is a novel way to use technology rather than taking, or you could take all your mates to the pub, by the way. That's another way that you could test it, which might be a bit more fun. But if you didn't have the money to control, especially if you're in the UK, taking your mates to the pub wouldn't go very well. But if you wanted to do a control testing in a context, I think that kind of technology can be really useful and cost effective, by the way.
Yeah, so I was just going to add too. So with the rise of AI and especially generative AI and things like that, one of the applications that is relatively accessible is the use of some of the virtual assistants. So you can have conversations with like Alexa, for example, and send out surveys and things like that and have them be voice-based. That's a novel approach, especially when you're doing like cooking type evaluations, things like that, where people are occupied, they're using their hands, they're interacting with the product, things like that. So you can actually have the virtual assistants be prompting respondents to say, oh, hey, it looks like you're, making dinner. What are you using tonight? And you can talk about like what they're bringing in, what tools they're using, what appliances, what food items, and that sort of thing. And you can be having a conversation rather than having to fill out a survey, which is really neat. And so you can also use people's cell phones. So for example, like if you're interacting with something and you are at the farmer's market, you can scan a QR code and still actually capture some data live. And so even if you're a startup, there's still different ways that you can use technology to be able to leverage insights and to interact with potential consumers and get that real-time information, which is pretty neat.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. I think that QR codes, I'm happy she said that. I think QR codes are really something that is a really unique tool that you can use, especially when you're a little bit smaller. So for us, what we have done in the past is use QR codes, and it brings you to a little survey, but then you get some type of kickback, whether it be a free case of product, whether it be some type of discount, whatever. But using that sort of bit of, I guess a touch of technology to actually get that survey, but then incentivize your consumer to, want to give you their feedback.
I have a couple of more questions, and then we can open it up to the floor. Hopefully, you have some burning questions you like to ask. So, the first question is, there's all these analogs, whether it's plant-based or plant-based foods, trying to manipulate into meat products or non-dairy products, and then, of course, non-alcoholic beverages, which want to taste like alcoholic beverages, but they have no booze in them. So my question is, how does AI help with that? And getting the right texture, can it help with that? The right texture, taste? Is there any making sure it has the right flavor profile? How does sensory science help in that factor?
I can talk about non-alcoholic beverages because I used to work for a beer company, but one of our biggest innovations was a non-alcoholic beer. And creating a non-alcoholic beer that is an enjoyable experience is actually more difficult than people realize, because if you strip out the alcohol, you aren't just stripping out the alcohol, you're stripping out all the flavor, but also mouthfeel and texture and experience. And so essentially, if you take all of that out, you've got to find a way to put it all back in again in order for the beer to be enjoyable. Why would you bother creating a non-alcoholic beer? Because particularly in Europe and the UK, where I'm from, enjoying a beer is a social experience. So you rarely find that beer is drunk individually. It's always drunk, and this is where context testing is really important, because it's always drunk and enjoyed in a pair or in a group. And particularly by men, and men feel way more comfortable enjoying a non-alcoholic beverage if it looks and tastes and smells like a beer, but if it's not non-alcoholic, than ordering a Diet Coke. Because also drink and driving laws in Europe and in the UK are pretty strict. So AI helps to screen a range of ingredients that you can use in order to recreate the flavor and the mouth feel experience of a non-alcoholic beverage, and will help you get there quicker in order for you to start prototyping quicker. But ultimately, you still need somebody to do the tasting at the end.
Liz, did you have something to say?
No, I think what Laura just said is exactly right, that you can use technology to a point to help you kind of find the foundations for how you might build the product. But having that sensory experience with the actual humans is the proof in the pudding, so to speak. There was another thought I had, and then I got distracted.
Well, I was going to say there is also technology
Yeah.
in the flavor itself, right? Because what you don't want to do is to create a non-alcoholic beverage that is just basically full of chemicals, right? That's really not an enjoyable experience either. So it's about rebuilding that beverage experience using natural ingredients that may be hop-derived or other plant-derived ingredients that can create that feeling and that taste. So that's a technology in itself.
And that's what I was going to say, is there's also a target market for not trying to replicate the alcoholic version or the dairy version or the what have you, but create a totally different product. So you guys have probably heard of Liquid Death, which is essentially like the heavy metal version of a non-alcoholic beverage, because people wanted to stay sober on tours at rock concerts and things like that, but still feel macho and like a hard rocker. And Liquid Death, I mean, I thought for a long time, I was like, why is there this hard alcohol at Target now all of a sudden, right? Because they've done such a good job of brand positioning. But it's basically just really tasty sparkling water. And so they created a totally different market for that, understanding that that was that's the consumer insight. They needed something that was non-alcoholic. They didn't want alcohol. They didn't want the experience of alcohol, but they wanted the social experience, the context
Still
of being
in an
able to feel
alcoholic
in.
setting.
Exactly. So alcohol or AI might not be able to help do that. I think that's still where it's understanding,
No,
like
that's-
what's the culture.
That's clever branding for sure.
Dalton, when you were developing your product, I'm sure you took that in consideration as well. The mouthfeel, because you have these two, kombucha and coffee, you wanted to make sure it had the elements of both. So was there sensory science involved?
I mean, yeah, I think for me, it was really about the overall sensation that we were trying to replace. And so, just a little bit of background. Kombucha essentially gives you the alertness and focus of coffee, but without any of those negative drawbacks. And so for me, I kind of had to look into, why are people consuming coffee, and what are they looking to get out of coffee? And it's not always the taste, right? Like most times, in most cases, I have found it really is just that feeling. And so for me, I wanted to position our product in a way that gave you that feeling, but without any of those drawbacks, and then recognize and really the use occasion and the point in the day, which for me, I look at that as a midday sort of beverage. And it's like, okay, what types of beverages do people typically consume at midday, whether it be a sparkling water, some type of soda. And so for me, it's like, okay, let's give us the feeling of coffee first, but then let's give you that experience that you're used to having at midday, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. So that gives you the carbonation that the product has, that gives you the slight sweetness, the little bit of flavoring. So for me, it really was looking at, number one, what is the sensation that I'm trying to provide, but then at what point in the day are we trying to exist in, and what are consumers looking for, and using that to sort of drive the sensory components.
Okay, we're gonna wrap this up. Like I said, I'm gonna open it to questions before we wrap this. Before I do that, I just wanted to get a couple of takeaways from you all. So starting with Dalton, some takeaways, just one takeaway for the audience about sensory science.
So sensory science, even though it has science in the word, you don't have to be a scientist. And I really want to harp on that, because I think a lot of times brands will kind of get caught up in feeling as though they don't have the resources to sort of evaluate their product. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to have any fancy machines. A human and a piece of paper is a lot of times all you need.
Dr. Laura?
I think sensory science will be the hill that I will die on, probably. I think that I think as we look to the future of food, and we look to securing food supply, we're going to be looking at different ways to look at food versus how we have grown up. So that means that we will need to look at incorporation of upcycled ingredients. We will need to look at alternative ways to grow food. We will need to look at alternative versions of things, which may or may not be a plant-based burger or a bean-based burger or cultivated meat. So that means our sensory palette is going to have to change with that. And so sensory science has always been important, but it will become even more important because we want people to be fed, we want them to be nourished, we want them to have good food, but we also want them to have joy. And if there is no greater joy in life than eating, right? So sensory science becomes even more important than it was before.
And Liz,
Yeah.
take us home.
Okay. So yeah, I think one of the things that is very salient for me is knowing that humanity is always going to come first within sensory science and hopefully within the food and bev industry or CPG in general, that humanity comes first and then technology and science comes second, right? So you need to make sure that you're still creating something that is resonant with people, right? That is delivering on sensory expectations, it's delighting them in some form or fashion, it's solving a problem, it's relevant to them. That comes first, and then you figure out the science and the technology to make sure that that happens. So to me, that's kind of the be all end all.
Fantastic. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you. You guys are fantastic. I love the little debate. It's great. People love that.
Said she wanted it, so we gave it. We brought it.
They brought
right?
it.
Delivered.
Delivered. Any questions?
Yep, definitely great discussion. So my question was around
Can you stand up and give your name
sorry.
and name of your company, please?
Shantanu Yusuf. I work in ACH Foods, and we're trying to innovate in the Better For You pancake mix. And one of the challenges we've had recently was what benchmark do we choose, right? And there were two schools of thought internally within the company. One was find a nutritional match, but then marketing and insights, they pushed for a top market seller, because their argument was, well, the benchmark you guys chose, R&D, that's a very poor seller, and it's going to get discontinued soon, like how the sales were tracking. So in those type of situations, what's your recommendation for how do you choose the benchmark, and what would be your action standard for pass or fail?
So I'll jump in. Sorry, Laura. I think that.
Really sorry. Go ahead, Dalton.
No, I'm not. So I think that it all depends on what positioning you want. I mean, if the position is to be the highest nutritional value, then absolutely you need to go for matching the benchmark of whatever that not great selling product is. But if the product is to be the best tasting but maybe not the most nutritious, that's the benchmark. In my opinion, I think that it should be a bit of a combination of both, because obviously the product needs to taste good for the consumer to come back. But there are many consumers who don't care that much about the taste, and really they just want 50 grams of protein a day, or for breakfast. And if that's the case, then that's sort of the benchmark that you need to shoot for.
The correct answer, I'm only joking. He's right. The correct answer is both. Because if you want to disrupt the pancake market, then you're going to have to take on the market leader. But you also want to be better for you, which means it has to be nutritious. So your testing has to do basic. You look at me like I agreed with you.
Okay.
I agreed with you. I said you were correct. You have to design your testing around both benchmarks, actually, which I know makes it more complicated and probably a bit more expensive. But if you're going to be as disruptive as it sounds like you want to be, then that's probably the best way to answer all the questions that you're trying to answer.
Yeah, so I think this comes back full circle to at the beginning of our discussion of really understanding who your target market is and understanding, okay, like, am I trying to sell into, moms with kids, and I'm trying to make sure that my, item is going to be very friendly for children, and they are trying to get nutrition into their kids. Am I selling into people who are CrossFitters and at Orange Theory all the time and want something to, be able to microwave or toast right after they come out from working out? Like, who is it that you're trying to sell to? Because you're going to want to test with those people, and you're also going to want to understand, are they the people who are actually going to purchase this? Is it going to be useful to them, right? So you really need to understand what is the question that we need to answer. And sometimes it is both. Sometimes you need to know, okay, how am I going to stack up to Bisquick? How am I going to stand up to Kodiak Cakes? How am I going to, who are the people that we're going to be selling to? Because then you're also going to have to sell that product in. So not only do you need to know whether your consumers are going to like it, but then what retailer are you trying to break in with? And how are you going to position it to them as to why they want it on their shelf, right? So there's a couple of different stakeholders and key decision makers that you're going to have to make sure you're satisfying. And sometimes it's internal too. Like, who are your salespeople? Are they going to get excited about selling it in based on what information? So all those types of questions and gatekeepers are the things that you need to think about.
Also, who's tasting it, right? Because the parents are buying it, but presumably the children are tasting it. I don't have children, but I understand that if you buy something they don't like and they never eat it again, then it's a waste of money, and then you're going back to the market leader that probably isn't better for you, right? So that's also another stakeholder group that you need to factor into your decision.
Okay. Well, I think we're out of time. So I didn't know if we had
She's
any more
thinking,
questions.
thank God for that.
No, you guys were.
You guys will
are
stop
fant-
talking and say.
You guys are fantastic. But if you have any additional questions, please feel free to.
And Dalton
talk
and
to
I will
them.
be going for round 3 later on at
In the
about
parking
5
lot.
o'clock in the parking lot.
Yes. Yeah. It's after
Not
4.
only joking. Not really.
Okay. So thank you very much for having us. Thank you for coming.